Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Susanna Blume, and I'm the Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. And today, joining me at the summer edition of the CNAS Virtual Fireside is General J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations. General, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Susan. I really appreciate it. I'm glad it's still the summer season and not the fall season after our first attempt to connect virtually, but thanks for the opportunity today.
Of course. So General Raymond and I are going to have a bit of a chat about Space Force, Space Command, their missions and their organizations. But before we get started, I'm just going to run through a few admin notes here. This conversation is public and will be recorded, and we will post the video after the conclusion of the event. And we're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end of our event here today to take questions from you, the audience here in Zoom. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And please also note that we will not be taking any anonymous questions, so you must identify yourself in order to get an answer. And for those participating natively in Zoom, for optimal viewing, we recommend that you click on video settings in the lower left corner of your screen and select hide non-video participants. And we also recommend that you select gallery view in the upper right-hand corner. And so with the admin taken care of, I'd like to invite General Raymond to make a few opening remarks. General?
Thanks again, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today, and I appreciate everybody tuning in. These are kind of weird times that we live in, that we don't get to do these things face-to-face as much, but it provides a great opportunity to tell our story and do so in a manner that connects maybe more people that we could do than if we just did it in person. So I, again, appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate CNAS for hosting this forum, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Space Force is just 7 months old, and I'll tell you, as a new branch of the armed services, we've made great strides, and not just in kind of building the service, which are things that you have to do, but I would suggest that not only we're building the service, but we're delivering advantage for our nation today. And I think that's absolutely critical, because space is foundational to our way of life, and it's foundational to our way of war. And the reason why both the Space Force and Space Command were stood up was to meet the needs of the National Defense Strategy and be part of that global integration, if you will, the Joint Force, to be able to provide space to our nation and to make sure that those capabilities are always there. And when you walk in the room and you turn on the light switch, the lights always come on. We want to make sure that when you walk in the room and proverbially turn on the light switch, that space is always there. And so what I thought I would do, just to prime the pump for questions in the conversation going forward, is just to kind of walk you through some of the things that we've been focusing on in this first 7 months. So the Space Force is 7 months old. U.S. Space Command actually stood up on the 29th of August. And so it's nearing its 1 year birthday later this next month. But, on the Space Force side, we conducted the first X-37 launch from the Space Force. We've also launched the last of the AEHF satellites, and we launched a GPS satellite and supported numerous other launches out of Cape Canaveral, including supporting the first human space flight on the U.S. soil since the end of the space shuttle era, which was a great event for our nation. We operationally accepted the space fence, which is a critical space situational awareness capability for us, and we operationally accepted a GPS-3 satellite. One of the things I'm really excited about is we've drafted our first ever capstone warfighting doctrine for space. It's at the printers. We're expecting that to get delivered here in the next couple of days, and we're going to roll that out either next week if it comes in on time, or the week after, but it's imminent. I'll tell you, it defines military space power as a distinct form of military power, which will be a first, and it's a foundational document that will inform the ethos and the values of this new Space Force. You may have read that we've responded to a Russian on-orbit activity that had characteristics of a weapon, and we've been working very closely on that, and worked very closely with our allied partners on that, which I'm proud of as well. One of the things that the Space Force is meant to do is to unite the Department of Defense in the different aspects of, all the different organizations that do space, and bring unity of effort across the Department of Defense, be able to reduce duplication of effort, reduce costs, and get capabilities onto orbit that we need. And I'm proud of what we've done with the missile warning, missile defense architecture work, bringing in the different organizations and uniting them in common purpose, and briefing the JROC on that, and getting a table slap on the way forward. So I'm really, really excited about that work. And I think that's going to pay huge advantages for our department going forward. We built our first budget, and we've submitted that to the Department of Defense. And so we're in that process as we speak. You may have read last week, we have, now that space is a warfighting domain, we've had to change the way we train our operators. And so we've completely revamped over the course of the last couple of years the basic school for space operators. And we've just implemented and just graduated the very first class from our follow-on warfighter focused training for space electronic warfare, orbital warfare, and space battle management. That's a first for us, and that graduation just happened this past week. In these days of COVID, we've also done virtual things, and just yesterday participated in a what we call combined space operations principals meeting with our closest partners in space, and that's Australia, Canada, UK, New Zealand, France, and Germany. Had a great dialogue there, and I'll tell you the partnership that we enjoy today with our international partners is extremely strong, and providing all of our nations great advantage. On the establishment front, we've been focusing a lot on what does the Space Force look like. We've done a lot of planning on what does the headquarters look like. When the Space Force first stood up in December of last year, the initial planning that had gone on even before the law was signed had our headquarters staff of being a little over 1,000 people. We've now whittled that down to less than 600. We're still finalizing the details of that, but we are wanting to be a very small, agile, lean force that can move fast. And so we're cutting bureaucracy and streamlining. I'm proud of how we've landed today. We've also done a lot of planning on what does the organization look like below the Pentagon level. And today, in a virtual ceremony out in Colorado Springs, we've just completed the largest restructure of space organizations since Air Force Space Command stood up in 1982. And that's we've stood down all of our space wings, the 21st Space Wing, 50th Space Wing, 460th Space Wing, and the groups, and we've collapsed them into what we were calling deltas, and they're mission-focused deltas. So Space Domain Awareness Delta, Space Electronic Warfare Delta. We've collapsed 2 layers of command, again, getting after a lean, agile structure that can go fast and enable accountability and agility. That ceremony happened just an hour or so ago, and I'm really excited about that. We're also working to flatten the Pentagon structure across the board, and in that missile warning, missile defense thing of uniting folks into common purpose, we're really working to flatten that bureaucracy so we can streamline the acquisition system requirements processes, the architecture processes, and deliver advantage again for our nation. We've also built our new personnel system, if you will. And so, on December 20th, I became the first person in the Space Force. I hired Chief Master Sergeant Roger Toberman as our senior enlisted advisor. He became number 2. We had 86 Air Force Academy cadets that became number 3 through 88. We have 18,000 people that are assigned to the Space Force, and we then opened up an application process, and we needed about 6,500 folks or so, and we got close to 9,000 applicants. So this week and next week, we're actually holding boards to then select which ones of those will transfer over into the Space Force. Again, as a small force, we can be extremely selective and get the talent that we need. We want to build this service as the first digital service. And so that's one of the key tenets that we're working through, and really working to build the digital personnel part of that as well. And we're excited about the opportunities. And then we've done a lot of the cultural things, and we have the seal, we have a flag. Just yesterday, we announced our logo, and then we announced our motto, which is Semper Supra. That came from a young airman over in Germany. He sent that in to me and said, "Hey, I came up with an idea," and it was spectacular. It just said, "Hey, that's it," and we announced that yesterday. And we've done all of that under a pandemic, and making sure that, one, we're good citizens to the neighborhoods that we live in, that we're playing by the rules, we're following the guidelines, and that we have taken very active measures to make sure that we can protect our ability to provide space capabilities to the nation and to the world. And I'm proud of the efforts that we've done on that. So with that kind of as a primer, if you will, to generate conversation, I'll turn it back over to you and look forward to dialogue.
Yeah, sir, that is a frankly breathtaking amount of activity here just in a few short months, and particularly under the current limitations of the pandemic. So, many congratulations to you. It's absolutely amazing. I want to start this conversation actually where I normally start these conversations, and that's with the strategy. And I wonder if you can just take us through how U.S. strategic thinking about space has evolved over the course of the past 10 years or so. And what has that meant for how we organize and equip in space? And there really has been a pretty significant change in this area, even just in the past couple of years.
It's been an unbelievable few years, and so what I'd say, what I'd suggest to you in the audience, the biggest fundamental change that we've had in space is the realization that space is a warfighting domain, just like air, land, and sea. A handful of years ago, that wasn't something that we talked about. The U.S. doesn't want space to become a warfighting domain. We want to deter conflict from occurring. But our competitors and potential adversaries have a vote in this, and so that realization that space is contested, it has been the thing that's been the driving factor. If you look at the national security strategy, it talks about access to space and freedom to maneuver in space is a vital national interest. It goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing here, but if anybody interferes with that access or ability to maneuver, we're going to respond at a place, time, domain, and manner of our choosing. The National Defense Strategy talks about global competition. And if you look at what space is, it is a global domain that we are actively competing in each and every day. Now that every speech I give, including what I just said, was, space is a warfighting domain, just like air, land, and sea. I say it every time. The implications of that, though, that rolls off our lips really easy these days. The implications of that are significant. And a lot of what, I just walked you through on that list is driven by that fact. The reason why the United States chose to elevate both the warfighting part of space, which was U.S. Space Command, which is, from a component of U.S. Strategic Command, separating it out to be its own warfighting combatant command called U.S. Space Command, and then on the organized, train, and equip side, the Space Force, which organizes, trains, and equips, and provides capabilities to U.S. Space Command to be able to operate. The reason why we elevated that was to elevate space to the level commensurate to its importance to our national security. And so if you think about that now, if it's a warfighting domain, you have to organize, train, and equip differently. We can't train our operators to be operating equipment without a threat. The analogy I use to our to the folks that operate capabilities for me is, if you were flying on an airplane, who would you want to be your pilot? And I always talk about Sully. That man is a hero. I mean, he's an incredible pilot. He if something happens on that plane, you're going to land and you're going to get off that plane. But Sully isn't operating, when he takes off out of New York, he isn't operating under a threat. And so the fighter pilot mentality is also, they're great pilots, but they have to operate in a different domain. That requires a different type of training. And so, I talked about up front, we just developed our warfighter training for space. That's, again, and revamped our whole initial courses to get after that threat and to be able to train our operators to operate in that contested environment. So the United States, our allies, and the nation has those capabilities at their fingertips all the time. It requires that we transform our architectures in space. Today, our satellite constellations are relatively small in numbers and they're large satellites. We want to diversify that. We want to make that, we want to change the way we architect that. And so that's a different thing. I talked a little bit about partnerships. In the past, you really didn't need partnerships because it was a peaceful domain. You just, as long as you could launch a satellite and it survived launch and it survived what we call infant mortality. When it gets on orbit, it works. You were good to go. That's not the case today. And so the partnership piece of that is probably the area that I'm most proud of. We have really developed strong partnerships with the countries that I mentioned and others. It requires new ways of harnessing data. The challenges that we face in space are big data problems. And that's why we're building the service to be a digital service up front that's data driven, and that you can make decisions with data in a domain that's extremely large. And basically, if you think through it, we have to mature the space warfighting domain just like all the other domains. And so rules of engagement, all those types of things have to happen. And that's the hard business that we're getting after each and every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's really is like a breathtaking change in mentality over the course of just a couple short years in terms of really thinking about space as a warfighting domain, which we can see, particularly in the defense space strategy, which you just released a little over a month back. And I have a couple questions just based on the unclassified summary that accompanied that document. And, first is I was a little bit surprised to see the phrase ensuring the availability of these capabilities is fundamental to establishing and maintaining military superiority across all domains. And I was surprised by that because a lot of the work that we're doing here at CNAS, and particularly my colleague, Chris Doherty, is kind of based on the premise that the U.S. is probably not going to have all domain superiority as it would head into a high-end conflict with a country like China, for example. And so I'm wondering what the balance is as you think about these issues between, aiming for that goal, but making sure that even if all domain superiority is something that the Joint Force can't achieve, we can still fight and win.
And so my goal again, going back to the reason why we stood up a Space Force and the Space Command is to be able to ensure that space superiority. I am 100% convinced that we can do that superiority today. I say this every time as well. We're the best in the world in space, but our competitors are moving very, very fast. We exercise very closely, and one of the things that you get when you stand up a new combatant command, you play in exercise with our combatant command partners in a much more integrated way than we could do at a component level. And so I think you would expect us to come to work every day, making sure that we can protect and defend those capabilities. That's been our focus. That's why we stood up the command. But yet we're realistic, and we plan for a whole plan and exercise and train and war game for a variety of scenarios. And again, I think that's the value of standing up a force that can organize, train, and equip, and put us in a position that can operate through that contested environment, and then on the warfighting side, they can integrate more closely with the combatant commands around the world and exercise, train, and war game to be able to meet the full spectrum of threats and opportunities that we have going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And so just digging a little bit deeper on the point you just mentioned in terms of integrating with the other services and acting as a true joint force. LOE 2 of the strategy integrates space into national joint and combined operations. Also surprised me a little bit just because, from my old seat in the Pentagon, the dependence of the joint force on space already felt so complete, which in a sense is a vulnerability. And so I wonder, when you were coming up with that line of effort, what do you think the unfinished business is in that space?
So it's interesting. When I look at the Department of Defense's role in space since the 50s, I mean, we've been involved in it from the very early stages, and it was great power competition back then. It was the Cold War. It was then the Soviet Union and the United States. I mean, it was again, uh, competition at the highest level. When the Cold War ended, and the threat to space that was there back then went away, if you recall, it was right on the, Desert Storm was right on the heels of that. And so Desert Storm, uh, we saw the first um, opportunities to start integrating space capabilities into theater operations. You saw that with the left hook in Desert Storm through the desert. How do you do that? Well, you do that with GPS. You can't, in a featureless train at night with no street signs, you're not going to find your way. You do it with GPS. At that time, GPS wasn't even fully up and running. We saw the first use of precision weapons. And then we saw using strategic assets to do Scud missile detection, if you will. And so coming down at the end of that war, our focus, and the next demarcation line, I would say, is kind of 2007. Our focus, almost my whole career, was focusing on integrating space into the fight. And we have done so tremendously. There's nothing we do, as I said, as a joint or coalition force, from humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, all the way up to combat, that it doesn't have space enabled in it in every step of the way. What's different, though, and what is so important, is that we've done that in a benign domain. And in 2007, China shot down one of their own satellites and blew up one of their own satellites, and sent a message, a strong message, that space is no longer a benign domain. So I agree with you that we have embedded space throughout everything that we do. Now there's this threat, and now you have to be able to do it in a way that can survive that threat, and that threat is alive and well and concerning. That's the difference.
Absolutely. So again, sticking with kind of a similar theme here, I want to talk about the joint warfighting concept that the department is hard at work on. And it's I think pretty obvious to most of us, even here on the outside, that space capability is absolutely essential to making a new kind of all domain operational concept work. And I was wondering if you can step us through a little bit, what is the Space Force role in bringing that concept to reality?
Yeah, I will. And there, I would say on this, there's a little bit of joint of Space Force and Space Command as part of this. I think if you were to, again, in the Space Command hat, the warfighting hat part of it, when we stood up Space Command back last August, one of the reasons why we wanted to stand up Space Command was not just to have a combatant commander that comes to work every day solely focused on space. When space was part of Stratcom, it was probably the Stratcom commander's third priority. If you look at the full laundry list of missions that Stratcom had, now we separated and said, okay, now we have a combatant commander that comes to work every day focused on it. The other reason why we wanted to do this was to further advance that joint warfighting construct, that the national defense strategy that recognizes global competition. We felt that by standing up U.S. Space Command, we would help advance that. Space operators, by their nature, think globally. It's a global domain. There's not lines on a map, in space, that it's a global domain. And if you look at the AOR that space has, the AOR is actually 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface globally and higher. And so it is really important that when you that we integrate with every combatant command around the world. And that's one of the reasons why we made space a geographic combatant command rather than a functional combatant command, because space is a place, and it allows us to better integrate with those combatant commands forward, and to help inform this joint warfighting construct that's being developed. On the Space Force side, my job is to make sure that we build those capabilities and train those operators to think globally. And as I talked about the need to have operators that think like warfighters, that's a two-part challenge. That's making sure that space operators think like a warfighter, that they are. But the second thing it's making sure that more traditional warfighters also have a better understanding of space. And so that is another big reason why both Space Command and Space Force were stood up. one of the things I'm most proud of is that in the Space Command hat side, although we're just a year old, we are already having a leading voice in in the concept as it's being developed.
That's so interesting. I want to dig a little bit deeper on what you just mentioned regarding Space Command being a geographic combatant command. Because, I'm thinking again back to my days in the Pentagon where we were talking about, certain scenarios where you might have horizontal escalation in a conflict that crosses those seams between geographic combatant commands and the real C2 challenge that then presents. And so thinking about space, which is a part of every potential conflict that the U.S. might fight, it seems like that structure of thinking about Space Command as geographic Space Command has built in a seam that then has to be overcome. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how you think about that in kind of operational planning constructs or otherwise?
Yeah. So one of the great benefits of standing up, again, I'm going to be, when I answer my questions, I'll try to be very specific on which hat that I'm talking to, because I wear several different hats. But in the U.S. Space Command hat, one of the critical reasons, one of the first business, if you will, that we're working on is to develop that planning and to build the team to do that planning. And we've already published our first campaign plan in the command, and that I signed that. Don't quote me on this; it was a month or two ago, but that's been signed. This requires us to plan in lockstep with our geographic partners. If deterrence were to fail and we were to get into a conflict with a peer competitor, it's going to be, as the National Defense Strategy talks about, it's not just going to be one combatant command focused on that. It's going to be a global effort. And so we have to plan together. So what we've done in U.S. Space Command is stood up teams called Integrated Planning Elements. It's modeled very closely off of what Cyber has done with Cyber Command's Integrated Planning Elements. And we are embedding those planning elements forward with the geographic combatant command partners that we have. And that as they do their planning and we do our planning, we do it together. And that has proven to be extremely valuable. And it's something that we're committed to doing. Though now we don't have all those teams stood up yet. We're in the establishment stages of it. But I will tell you, the folks that we already have out there doing that work, and when we play in exercises, having that connection at the combatant command level has been extremely valuable. And I would say it's been extremely valuable for both us and for our partners that we're in lockstep with.
Yeah. So I am almost out of time here. I want to make sure we save some time for our audience, but I do want to ask you, one more question about,
sure.
Standing up a whole new service, which, as you mentioned, is a very rare event indeed. And it presents an opportunity to get a lot of things right from the outset. And I'm wondering, what do you think the things are that you're really focused on making sure you get right as you stand up the new service? And in particular, I was wondering how you're thinking about the Space Force approach to diversity, inclusion, giving opportunities to underrepresented groups.
Right.
Because you're creating a whole new service culture from scratch here.
Absolutely. As I tell my team, we've got a great opportunity. My marching orders have been build this service with a blank sheet of paper and be bold. I mean, every speech I give to my team is be bold. I think I have I see two challenges. One is that, we don't capitalize on that opportunity, and we don't think bold enough. And two, that when we do think bold, we've got to get that boldness implemented. And so it allows us, again, and what I've told my team is that when we're all said and done, when we have this thing all planned and we're up and running fully, all the other services should be looking over our shoulder and saying, man, I wish I had what they had. Because if we haven't, then we haven't thought bold enough, because we've been given an opportunity. And that's on everything from how do you do architectures, how do you do requirements, how do you the professional and personal management, human capital management. I mean, I would really like to be able to take folks from the Space Force, send them to industry for a year, send them to NASA for a year, send them over to NRO for a year, bring them back. I mean, we want to have portability into all kinds of space opportunities. We want to look at differences between full-time and part-time. And that leads into how do you use reserve forces? And Congress told us to do a study on how best to use reserve forces. And so we're starting this fresh. And the diversity piece is part of that effort. We are focusing on that really, really hard. As we build this service, we have an opportunity to get the diversity piece right from the beginning, and that's what we're working hard to do. That will be our strength, and it's a great opportunity. It's exciting to come to work every day, given a task to build something, and I'll tell you, to build something, but also deliver advantage while you're building it is what we're trying to do. We've got a great Secretary of the Air Force in Barbara Barrett. She is a big proponent of space, has been hugely helpful to us. I'll also tell you that having a partner in the Air Force like Dave Goldfein, and who's our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, been a long time boss of mine. I consider him a dear friend and mentor. Having him at our side as we're standing this up has also been very helpful. And a lot of the work that I went through, that list, which I'm very, very proud of, we couldn't have done it without the strong support of General Goldfein and the Air Force. But we're gonna build this service in a way that you will be proud of, that Americans will be proud of, and that will protect and defend our ability to operate space capabilities that are vital to both our way of life and to our way of war.
Great. Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to go over to the audience and see what their questions are. And audience, as a reminder, if you have a question, please submit using the Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar. We've got a lot of really great questions in here already, so I'll do my best to make it through. First, from Frank Wolf from Defense Daily. Frank asks, what duplication of space R&D and acquisition programs exist, and how does Space Force plan to address the issue?
Yeah, so, there's, I'll give you an example of one in the past. Over the last few years in my Air Force Space Command hat, we were building a satellite that was going to do space situational awareness. Well, there was another organization, NRO, that was building a satellite that does space situational awareness. And so when we looked at it and we looked at the strategic environment that we were facing, we said, why do we need to build that satellite when somebody else is already building it? And so we canceled that program, partnered with the NRO, and will deliver capability to our nation faster at a reduced cost. The other thing, just recently, the Space Force has been in, I talked about the importance of partnerships. We had to build 2 satellites to provide communications over the poles. Well, it turns out that Norway was already building 2 satellites. And so why can't we just put payloads onto those satellites? And so we entered a partnership with Norway. We'll put hosted payloads on those satellites. It saved the United States close to a little over $900 million, and we'll get capability onto orbit faster. And so those are 2 examples. But if you look at, the one that I'm really focusing on up front is the missile warning, missile defense piece of this. There's multiple different organizations that are building pieces of that enterprise. What the Space Force allows us to do is pull that enterprise together and to unite efforts and have somebody that can take an enterprise look at those various functions and make trades, save costs, reduce duplication of effort, get capability onto orbit, and get capability that the U.S. Space Command commander is going to need to be able to execute operations in the contested environment. So there's lots of opportunities going forward where the Space Force will be able to do that and deliver advantage.
Great. Next question is from Sandra Irwin of Space News.
Yes.
And she asks, you said the selection boards for Space Force officers will start soon. And she's asking, who sits on the evaluation boards, and are the selection criteria different than traditional Air Force boards?
Yeah, so Sandra, first of all, thanks for the question. the boards are actually have already started. They started this week. And so what we've done, there's, as I've described before, there's kind of three groups of people that when we looked at standing up the Space Force and taking it from the Air Force, there's space operators, and they are in mass all coming over. And so there's not a selection board for that. We're reviewing them, making sure that they're the right folks, but the vast majority of those come over, and they'll transition to the Space Force in the September timeframe. Then there's a group of people like security forces, civil engineers, services folks that will never come over to the Space Force, at least in the current plans, because the Space Force is really focused on space capabilities and its space operators, acquisition, intel, cyber, engineering, hardcore space focused things, not the support. We're going to rely on the Air Force for that. In that middle block then are acquisition, engineers, cyber, and the really cool thing that I'm excited about is we built a digital service, software developers. And we're going to have our own dedicated software development team built into this digital service. But for those that are in the Air Force today, like acquisition engineering and cyber, parts of those will come over and parts won't. So as we got volunteers from those services, we have defined the requirements, what the numbers are that are required in each of those career fields, and in those areas where there are greater folks that have applied, then we are in the process of having a board to score those records and pick those that will come into service. The folks that are on that board are space, as you would expect, Space Force senior leadership, and Brigadier General Deanna Burt out at in Colorado Springs is kind of leading that effort for us from that perspective.
Great. So switching topics right now, we have a couple different questions who are all asking about Russia's on-orbit operations yesterday. And I wonder if there's anything additional that you're able to share with us in this public forum about that.
I don't have anything additional to add. I did talk about, though, that Russia, back in January, I made a statement about a satellite that was on orbit that had the appearances of a weapon system that was very similar to what they did in 2017. And then that satellite had released another satellite at that time. Here recently, last week, that second satellite then released a projectile. And, it's clear they're doing weapons testing on orbit, and it's something that's very concerning. So we talked about that in the press, and some of our allied partners have as well.
Great. So I have two related questions here. The first is from Nicolas Jerome, who is the head of the space office with the Belgian Ministry of Defense, and he asks, you mentioned the wild, wild west situation, which characterizes the LEO environment today. And he's asking, do you think solving this requires, enhancing legal frameworks at the international level? And then John Klein from George Washington Space Policy Institute asks, do you see an operational requirement for debris removal in LEO, given its potential impact on, the military, our allies, and commercial space capability as well?
So first of all, when I've talked in the past about the wild, wild west, there's really, anybody can launch a satellite and put it into orbit, and there's really no rules. The only really rules that there are is when you launch something into geosynchronous orbit, you have to apply for a slot because of the value of that orbit based on the physics and the persistence that gives. Other than that, there's really no rules. I do think, and one of the things that we're working very closely with our partners on is to develop norms of behavior and how do safe and professional what do safe and professional operations look like in the space domain? So we're having a lot of those conversations. We are acting responsibly. We're trying to set those norms by the behavior in which we operate. We're transparent. We share data very freely across the board on space domain awareness to keep the domain safe for all. And I do think there's room and a need to develop norms of behavior. On the debris mitigation, debris is a challenge. It's not an overwhelming challenge right now. We can operate and through it, we act as the space traffic control for the world. You know, we monitor and track all those objects. You know, don't quote me on it now. The numbers keep going up, but there's probably close to 28,000 different objects in space. Just a small subset of those are actually satellites. The majority is debris. We track all that. We provide warning to the world to tell folks to move. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we working very closely with NASA, we repositioned the International Space Station to avoid potentially hitting a piece of debris. And so we take that very seriously. So with debris mitigation, I'll tell you, there's a lot of people thinking about it. I have yet to hear the great idea on how that will work. Space is really big, and there's a lot of you know, of the 20-something thousand objects that we track, we think there's about 500,000 other objects that we can't track because they're too small. So I do think, and there's a lot of people thinking about it. I hope something materializes where we can do that. But today we are operating through that by the active measures that we take to surveil space, to have the awareness of the space domain, and then we share that information broadly with the world to make sure that we can keep the domain safe for all to use.
Great. I've got a question here from Brian Dolan, who asks, you know, basically, what are the primary readiness concerns for Space Force, right? I mean, it's very, I'm paraphrasing him right now, but it's you know, very clearly different than kind of readiness metrics you would think about applying in the Air Force, for example. And so
there's similar metrics. I think the big shift for us, again, goes back to, you know, what you asked me, Susanna, about what's this big strategic point to this, is that it is now a warfighting domain. So, you know, the Space Force is looking at those metrics, making sure that those metrics are the right metrics to measure that readiness to be able to operate in a contested environment. And so that's been our big focus on readiness, shifting those metrics to a contested domain, and not just a benign domain, because it's different, and you have to be able to operate differently, and you have to be ready for that threat. And that's, again, the reason why we stood up a Space Force and a Space Command.
And I'll just ask you one last question here, because we're nearly at time. Two related questions here from Rebecca Cowan Hirsch, and then also from, and of course I've lost it here in the scroll, John Goller, who are both asking about issues related to overclassification or cross-pollination with industry. You know, are there any kind of plans or works in the horizon to make that a little bit easier?
There are, and it's something we're working very hard on. I'm actually hopeful it's not a great strategy, but I am very encouraged that we're going to make some advances in that. We have to. Our goal is to deter conflict, and it's hard to deter conflict if you can't talk about things that you have. It's also very hard to have international partners if you can't share data broadly. It's also very tough to have the partnerships we need with industry when we can't talk. Rebecca has been a strong partner of ours for years in helping us get our commercial integration cell off the floor out at the Combined Space Operations Center at Vandenberg. And I'm more than hopeful. I am very encouraged that you're going to see lowering of classification to be able to meet the needs that we have today to be able to operate successfully.
Great. And with that, General, I'd like to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your expertise here today. We're really grateful for the conversation.
Oh, I'm grateful as well. Again, I appreciate the opportunity. I hope we get an opportunity to do this again in the future. And for all those that listened in, Thanks for caring. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your questions. We're excited about the future. Not only is this an exciting time, it's a really, really important time for our national security. And I couldn't be more proud of the team that we've built on both the U.S. Space Command side and the Space Force side, two very new organizations that are standing up and delivering advantage. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of that with you today.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. And thanks to everybody who tuned in.